Hi, Scott Boats here with an introductory video to trust and estate litigation in Texas. Welcome back to boatslaw.com. Of course, this video is not legal advice. It's not intended as legal advice, and you should not take it as such. I want to start this video with a personal story, and that is the story of my father's estate in Beaver County, Oklahoma, the panhandle of Oklahoma. In the 80s, I was a student at U of H, and actually go back a couple years before I've left high school, and my dad gets a call from one of his sisters about my granddad, and my granddad was a very proud man, a self-made farmer, learned farming, was from Canada, had been a Canadian infantryman who saw action in 7 major engagements in World War I, was almost gassed to death, and had a pretty exciting life. Met my grandmother at Lake Louise. She was from Oklahoma. She went up there to ice skate and see the snow of Canada, I guess. But they ended up getting married, and he came down to Oklahoma and took over the farm and built one of the most prosperous wheat farms in Oklahoma, starting just before the Dust Bowl days of the Great Depression. And my father grew up on that farm in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl days of the Great Depression. And they all survived. Fast forward a number of years, early 80s, and my grandfather has lost capacity. Proud men can be stubborn, but it was necessary for a court to intervene in his personal affairs and appoint conservator, someone who takes responsibility for the affairs of a living person, and in this case, an incapacitated living person. Oklahoma calls what we in Texas call guardians. They use the word conservator. My grandmother could not serve because she too was incapacitated. They live long lives, as farmers often do. And so this one aunt became my granddad's conservator. Unfortunately, my aunt made some poor choices, perhaps got bad legal advice, did not have a good consigliere, a good counselor, legal counselor, and she was removed. And it was a traumatic experience. My father joined with one of his sisters, or I guess both of his other sisters, and brought the action against the aunt who was removed. Shortly after that, early 80s, around 1984, my granddad died while he was under conservatorship. But by that time, you see, because there was a dispute within the family, the court appointed a banker to be the conservator, and that's very common in these cases. The family has a dispute about what's going on, and so the court kind of punts. And how does the court punt? The court punts by appointing a third party unrelated to the situation, and in this case it was a banker, and courts often do that. And my granddad was deceased at that point, so that the conservator of my grandmother's person, the person who made healthcare decisions for my grandmother, that was another aunt who lived another 11 years or so, moved my grandmother to Oklahoma City into a nursing home. At any rate, there was some bad blood because of that lawsuit. The one aunt had been removed. People didn't talk to each other, but over time things kind of got better. And then when my grandmother died, we went up there, and I got to meet this lady who'd been removed, and just a wonderful, delightful human being, just wonderful sense of humor. And I was very grateful that I got to know her a little bit, because shortly after that, she died, just up and died, had a heart issue, unexpected. And I was very sad at the time that she died, because she was just a remarkable person, and I had gotten into this area of law. Trust and estate litigation, and that's what that case was about. But if you back up to when it all started, I was a high school student in Corpus Christi, Texas, and my dad was a connection foreman, maintenance foreman for Sun Pipeline there. Been growing up in Refugio, my dad was a welder. So my dad came home from the Second World War, where he had been a prisoner of war, and learned to trade and started welding. Ended up in different places, and different siblings were born different places. I was born down in Sinton in South Texas, and grew up in Refugio and Corpus Christi. But my father did not understand legal matters. And so my father, I remember the conversations about hiring a lawyer, and it's very intimidating because my parents they didn't hire lawyers. And, this whole process of how it worked and paying the lawyer and all that. Well, that happens. The independent third-party conservator bankers appointed. My dad would, from time to time, talk to him, I remember, and then I'm off to college at U of H, and my dad would ask me issues. Well, not too long after that, I'm clerking. Just before I graduated from college for a probate lawyer here in Houston. And, I'm talking about some of these issues my family went through. Then I go to school at U of H, the Law Center, and I'm paying attention to trust and estate litigation. Suddenly I'm out of law school, and this is what I'm doing. And I practiced solely in this area for the first 20 years of my law practice. I made a change in 2011, 2012, broaden it just a bit because I'd gone to run for public office, lost, and had the need to do some other things because the judges I knew were all dead, electorally defeated, or retired. So it was necessary for me to kind of move on to other things because I was no longer, I suppose you might call, a favorite. So I did indeed broaden my practice, partly also because I have a daughter who was frequently the subject of disputes between me and her mother, and so it became necessary for me to learn more child custody and family law issues. And when I got into them, they were just so incredibly fascinating. I was glad to have found the area. But when I first got out of law school, suddenly I'm the only lawyer in the family, and I'm going up with my parents to meet with this conservator banker about the estate. And, I got to know a little bit more about how these things work, these trust and estate litigation cases, from that personal experience. The lawyer I'd worked with, she handled these cases all the time, but just wasn't as personal to me. And when I finally went back up there to meet with the conservator, this time as a lawyer, things started to come together, and I kind of pasted together different memories over the last 12, 13, 14 years between the time my granddad was kind of like Joe Biden and didn't know what was going on and ended up with a conservator, and the time he passed away, and then the stuff that happened. And of course, when my grandmother died, aunt who had done the wrong things, her part of the estate was taxed with the costs and the damages, so it came out of her share of the estate. But she's a wonderful person, so grateful to have known her, and I'm sad it was for such a short period of time. These were remarkable people, all raised during the Dust Bowl days of the Great Depression. But when I was up there, to an extent, the estate had kind of been, looted, but I did get a couple of things from the desk of my grandfather, and it had been empty for about 15 years. It was in the old farmhouse out there. They didn't have indoor plumbing or anything like that, but up in the area where his office was, he had been president of the Oklahoma Farm Bureau, and so he had quite a memorabilia going. Of course, he'd been himself, saw action in World War I. His son, my father, had been a prisoner of war. My father had been missing for a little bit, and so my grandparents didn't know what happened to him, whether they would be Gold Star parents or whether their son was a prisoner of war. Well, he'd been shot down and taken prisoner by the Wehrmacht after a bombing mission. His B-17 had been shot down, but I found this picture, and it's a picture of my dad. And that's him, and keep him flying. But the thing is, I found a gold mine of stuff like this. There were pictures of my granddad and his World War I stuff, and there's a picture of my granddad in the hospital where he was recovering from being gassed, and found all this stuff that nobody else wanted. And that always stayed with me. This gold mine had been passed over. And so this picture, you got to understand, so my dad had given this picture to my grandparents. And he gave it to them before he was allowed to enlist. And he was trying to convince them that he should be allowed to enlist. This had been 1943 or so, and understand his father had seen war and seen death and all that. So he was lobbying him pretty hard, because truth is my father hated the farm and he wanted to get the hell away from there, and like all young men of that age, wanted a good adventure. And so he gave that to my grandfather, but my grandfather kept it in his most personal area all of his life. And during that period, undoubtedly, when my father was missing, and they weren't sure whether they would be Gold Star parents or what. But just an absolute precious piece of memorabilia. And sometimes in trust and estate litigation, you're always talking about the loss of property, and you're always dealing with that statement by Ben Franklin: if you want to know the true character of a person, then share an inheritance with them. If you want to know the true character of a person, share an inheritance with them. Now, in my situation, there was a reconciliation. There was absolutely a reconciliation, and it was just an absolute gift that happened. But in many of these cases where you're dealing with the disappearance of property, the wasting of assets, you're dealing with the issue of fraudulent wills, fraudulent documents, and the fraud can be the document itself. That is, it was not there when it was signed and it was inserted as a matter of fraud, or that's not really the signature. And the signature is actually a forgery. You run into all these sorts of issues with trust and estate litigation. Now, trust tends to imply old money. All right. Now, it doesn't have to be that old of money. It could just, but the point is, the people who deposited it into the instrument or into the entity are typically deceased, unless it's a living trust. But if it's a living trust, the issues really are going to be disputes over the capacity of the trustee. And if the maker is already dead, well, that little bit of time has passed, typically. But trusts tend to be that old money that's deposited somewhere. And I didn't have that in my situation, or my family didn't, my dad's family. Estate litigation does mean the actions of executors, and the executor didn't do anything wrong. Other fiduciaries, and in the case of my dad's family, the conservator had done something wrong, breached fiduciary duties. Fiduciary duties are harsh taskmasters which you must meet to the T. And if you want more information, just Google fiduciary duties. But that is where all the litigation is stirred up, in the area of trust and estate litigation. In this area, somebody who once had money probably is deceased. Now, you can have guardianship litigation, like with my granddad. He was beyond the point where he was oriented to time, place, and person, and he had no business running his life. In fact, there were a couple of annuity salesmen who got involved and kind of messed with my granddad a little bit, and annuity salesmen can do that at times. But anyway, that kind of got corrected too. Main thing was one family member had good intentions, and it just didn't work out well, which was unfortunate. But again, there was a kind of a reconciliation, which was just wonderful. But in this area of trust and estate litigation, you're dealing with issues of fiduciary duty. You're dealing with issues of accountings, issues of fees, and the use of property. There are areas associated with trust and estate litigation. There's a hot area known as elder abuse. And frankly, that strikes me as a bit of a synonym. Now, we can have elder abuse to the extent that protective services is involved. That's a physical form of abuse. But I think elder abuse is generally just a fancy new synonym that is utterly unnecessary, and rather it maybe ought to be more appropriately described as guardianship or conservatorship litigation, or just trust and estate litigation, estate code litigation, you might call it here in the great state of Texas. But I had that personal experience. Didn't know what I was getting into, but I've continued to work in that area, and I do have that personal background with it. Sometimes the most important stuff is overlooked, and maybe someone like me comes along and my life is richer just by having gotten to know the lady who was supposed to have done something wrong, and she did do something wrong, and then found the pictures that nobody else wanted. Pictures of people who are long gone and whose story has come to an end, but maybe that's the best kind of inheritance, because I do see this picture of my father, and I've kind of put that together, that they weren't sure if they were going to be gold star parents or what, because it's not like, the leader of the Wehrmacht called up Ike and said, we got boats. He's in this prisoner of war camp in the Moosburg, and he's almost starving to death because your people have done a great job of diminishing the German state's capacity to feed our own people, much less the unwanted guests like boats. But he wasn't. They weren't Gold Star, and so I'm here today to talk about it. If I can help you, shoot me an email. That's scott@boatslaw.com, and I wish you the very best.